The morning the foreman told Marin Tolliver she could help the cook's girl with the dishes, she didn't argue. She set down the bucket she'd been carrying, walked the length of the yard to the forge, and picked up the hammer her father had taught her to swing. The blacksmith's boy stepped out of her way without being asked. By the time the foreman came looking, she had the off-hind shoe off a mule that had thrown two grown men, filing the hoof as if she'd been born holding a rasp. Before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The kitchen, the porch, the long road home. I read every one of them, and I'm glad you're here. That was the first thing anybody at Crane's Reach learned about her. She didn't announce herself. She just did the work, and the work spoke for her. Crane's Reach sat in the long bend of the fallow valley, 12,000 acres from the gravel bench down to a creek that never quite dried up, though it came close that year. The drought had come on slow, the way droughts do, and it had settled in like a boarder who pays no rent. The grass was the color of old straw. The creek ran thin and brown. The cattle stood in the shade of the cottonwoods and did not move. Dust got into everything: the food, the bedding, the lungs. Mr. Hollis Crane owned the Reach. He was an old man with a bad heart and a way of looking at the horizon like he was measuring what he had left. He'd hired Ezra Tolliver in the spring, one hand for the roundup, and Ezra had written home that the pay was fair and the feed was short and the foreman was a man you watched. That letter had brought the rest of them, 6 brothers and their sister, come up from the gravel bench where their own place had gone under. Micah whittled, carving away his nerves in little curls of wood. Silas talked to horses in a low hum. Jonas could not sit still and checked the sky for weather the way other men checked their pockets. Thaddeus laughed too loud and clapped you on the back hard enough to move you. Jude, the youngest, followed Marin the way a shadow follows a body, and carried her hammer when she'd let him. And Ezra, the eldest, the one who'd been hired, squared his shoulders before he said anything, as if every sentence needed a foundation. Their father had died in the winter. August Tolliver had been the best farrier in 3 counties, and he had taught his daughter everything he knew, though he'd never once said it out loud. The mortgage had come due in the spring, and the bank had taken the place, so the Tollivers loaded what they could onto 2 wagons and drove the long road to Crane's Reach, because Ezra had a job and there was nowhere else to go. The foreman was a man named Rance Whitfield. He had a smooth voice and a way of smiling that never reached his eyes, and he ran the Reach the way a man runs something he means to own. He had been at the Reach 11 years, had learned the old man's habits and the old man's trust, and kept a ledger of his own that nobody had ever seen. The first thing Rance did with the Tollivers was put them to work and keep them hungry. The brothers got the jobs that broke men's backs: the fence line, the salt, the mucking out. Marin got told she could help the cook's girl with the dishes. That was the moment. That was the morning the hammer came down. She did not argue. She went to the forge and shod the mule, and when Rance came to find her, she looked up with the rasp still in her hand and said, "This mule's been favoring the off-hind for a month. Somebody's been letting it go lame on purpose." Rance's smile went thin. "You watch your mouth, girl, or you'll be back on the dishes." But he didn't send her back. He watched her, the way you watch a thing you don't understand yet. That night, in the lean-to off the barn, the brothers had been given straw for beds and a stove that smoked. Ezra asked her what she thought she was doing. "You're going to get us all run off," he said, squaring his shoulders. "We got 1 job between the 7 of us." "1. Then I'll get us 2, Marin said. Jude laughed, quiet, and Micah whittled, and nobody said anything else. But the question hung in the smoke of that stove, and it was the first question of the story. What was a girl doing with a farrier's hammer, and why did the foreman go pale when she picked it up? The second question came 3 days later, and it came with the draft team. The Reach ran on 4 mules and 2 big draft horses, a matched pair of grays that Crane had bred and was proud of. The grays were the heart of the place. They pulled everything that needed pulling. And on the 4th day, Rance came to the house with his smooth voice and thin smile and told Mr. Crane the grays had gone lame, both of them, and they'd have to be sold for glue before they died. Crane sat at the kitchen table with his bad heart and his measuring look, and he nodded, because he trusted the foreman, and because he couldn't see the animals for himself anymore. His legs had gone bad. But Marin had seen the grays. She had walked out to the corral that morning with her father's hammer in her belt, and she had seen what Rance had done. Their shoes had been pulled, not worn off, pulled, and their hooves had been trimmed down to the quick, so that they stood on raw, bleeding feet, and could not walk. A man makes a horse lame, and then he sells the horse cheap, and then he pockets the difference. She didn't say anything to Rance. She didn't say anything to Ezra. She went back to the forge, and she built a fire, and she set to work on shoes for 2 horses that nobody had asked her to save. That was the end of the world before it broke. Because Maren Tolliver had seen the truth, that the Greys had been lammed on purpose by the man who ran the place, and she had chosen to act on it, and there was no going back. The dust was still on the grass. The creek was still thin, but the girl at the forge had crossed a line she could not uncross, and the whole valley, without knowing it, had begun to turn. The Greys stood again in 9 days. Maren had worked on them in the evenings, after the brothers were done and the yard was quiet, because she'd learned early that the work nobody sees is the work that matters. She worked by the light of the forge and the sound of her own hammer, and she did not tell a soul. She trimmed the hooves back to true, she fit the shoes hot and set them cool, and she talked to those horses the way Silas talked to his, low and steady, until the fear went out of their eyes. On the 9th morning, Rance came out to find the corral gate open and the 2 Greys standing in the middle of the yard, heads up, ears forward, sound as the day they were born. He stood there a long moment. Then he went to the house and told Mr. Crane that the Greys had come right on their own, and that he'd been working them himself, and that it was nothing to make a fuss over. Crane believed him. Crane always believed him. But Crane had seen Maren at the books. She'd come in to sweep the kitchen and had found the old man at the table with a column of figures he couldn't make add up, and she'd stood at his shoulder and said, "That's the feed, sir. You're carrying the feed twice." And he'd looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. "Can you cipher?" he'd asked. "My father taught me," she'd said, which was true, and which was not the whole truth, because August Tolliver had taught her to cipher and to shoe and to read a horse's leg and to keep a set of books so honest they'd stand up in court. So she took the books. She took them to the lean-to at night and went through them by lamplight, and what she found there sat in her chest like a cold stone. The books said 400 head. The range held 300. The books said the Greys had been sold for glue. The Greys stood in the yard. The books said the Reach had lost money every year for 6 years, and the money had gone somewhere, and it had not gone into feed or fence or salt, because there was no feed and the fence was down and the salt was rationed. She showed the ledger to Ezra on the 10th night, in the smoke of the stove. He read it twice, and his face went the color of the ash. "You can't take this to Crane," he said, squaring his shoulders. "He'll believe Rance. He's believed Rance for 11 years. And Rance will run us off before the week's out. And then where are we? Back on the bench with nothing. You want to be the one who costs us the only job we got." "I want to be the one who does the work," Maren said. "That's all I've ever wanted." "Then do the work they pay you for," Ezra said. "Stay out of the books. Stay out of the forge. Let the Greys be somebody else's trouble." Maren looked at him a long time. Then she said, quiet, the way her father had taught her to say things that mattered, "Iron don't lie. It either holds or it don't. And this ranch is coming apart at the shoes." Ezra didn't answer. He just stared at the stove, and the smoke went up, and the question went up with it. What does a man do when the only thing standing between his family and the road is a lie he's been told to keep? The brothers split like a fence rail. Micah whittled and said nothing. Silas hummed to the horses and said nothing. Jonas checked the sky and said the weather was coming, which was true and which meant nothing. Thaddeus clapped Ezra on the back and said the girl was making trouble, and trouble got men run off. Only Jude stood with her, and Jude was 14 and carried her hammer and believed in her the way the young believe in anything that doesn't lie. The cook's girl, a round woman named Bess who ran the kitchen at the Reach and had been there longer than Rance, took Maren aside one morning and said, "You watch that one girl. He's got a ledger of his own, and he's been filling it for years." And when Maren asked how she knew, Bess just wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Because I've been here long enough to count what comes in and what goes out, and it don't match." So the choice sat on Maren like the dust sat on everything else. The easy path was plain. Put the ledger back, let Rance sell the Greys and the stock, keep the family's one job, keep her head down until the drought broke or the world turned. The hard path was plainer still. Take the ledger to Crane, watch Rance's smile go thin, and bet everything, the job, the family, the roof, on the chance that the truth, Given enough time and enough patient people, would surface on its own. And the world closed in while she carried it. Rance must have seen the change in her, because he moved first. He cut the brothers' pay by half, on account of the drought, and he moved the Tollivers out of the lean-to and into the old tack room, which had no stove and a roof that leaked. He told Ezra the Reach had no more work for a family of 7 and that they'd be expected to move on when the roundup was done. And he went to the corral one night, alone, with a set of shoes in his hand and a plan in his eye, and Marin watched him from the dark of the barn and knew what he meant to do. He meant to lame the Grays again, for good this time, and sell them before anybody could ask a question. She could have stopped him then. She had the hammer. She had the truth. But she had no proof that would hold, and she had a family sleeping in a leaking room, and she had learned, in a long life of being overlooked, that the truth only surfaces when somebody is patient enough to hold it up to the light. So she waited, and she watched, and she kept the ledger in the lining of her coat, where Rance's eyes couldn't find it. And that was the weight of the choice, not the doing of it, but the carrying of it, alone, in the dark, with the storm coming and nobody to tell. Here's the question I want you to carry with you into the dark part of this story. When everything you've built gets called worthless, when the world looks at you and sees nothing worth keeping, what is it that makes you keep building anyway? Hold that. We're going to need it. The storm came on a Tuesday, and it came like a judgment. The sky went the color of a bruise in the middle of the afternoon, and the wind came down off the bench and took the dust up with it. And then the rain came. The first rain in 4 months, hard and cold, and driving sideways. The creek rose. The cottonwoods bent. The Reach, which had been dying of thirst, stood in water up to its fetlocks and shook. And in the middle of it, Rance Whitfield moved. Marin saw him from the barn, a lantern moving through the rain toward the corral, and behind him the dark shapes of the Grays and the best of the breeding stock, a dozen head, being walked out into the storm. He meant to drive them the 8 miles to the railhead at Fallow Creek and sell them before the rain stopped, before anybody could count, before the truth had a chance to catch up. He'd done it before, she realized. That was how the books lied. He sold in the rain, when nobody watched. She moved to stop him, and he caught her. He was faster than she'd given him credit for, and stronger, and he knew the dark of the barn better than she did. He came out of the dark of the barn like he'd been waiting for her, and he put a hand on her shoulder that was not gentle, and he said, "I thought you'd be smarter than this, girl." And he walked her to the tack room, and put her inside and turned the key, and she heard his boots go away through the rain. The tack room had no window and one door and a roof that leaked. The rain came through in a cold stream onto the floor. Marin stood in the dark with her heart going like a hammer, and she thought about her family asleep in the other room, and about the Grays being walked to their deaths, and about the ledger in the lining of her coat, which Rance had not found because he had not thought to look for it in a woman's coat. She had a file. She always had a file, a farrier's file, small and worn, that she kept in her belt for the work nobody saw. The lock on the tack room was old, and the file was patient, and the rain was loud enough to cover the sound. It took her a long time. It took her until her fingers were raw and the water was up to her ankles. And then the door came open, and she was out in the storm. The gray horse, the one she'd shod, the one whose fear she'd talked out of with her low, steady voice, was still in the corral, because Rance had taken the others and left the one that had thrown 2 grown men. She caught him with a handful of rope in her voice, and he stood for her, and she rode him bareback into the storm, low over his neck, the rain needling her face, the ledger in her coat, the file in her belt. 8 miles to Fallow Creek. The road was a river. The Gray was sound. She'd made him sound, and he ran like he owed her something, and maybe he did. She found Rance at the railhead, in the lee of the freight house, with the Grays and the stock tied to the loading chute and a man from the stock buyer's office counting out money in the lamplight. She rode in out of the rain and slid off the Gray and stood in front of the chute with the water running off her, and Rance's smile went thin and then went away. "You're a long way from the dishes, girl," he said. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Marin said. And she pulled the ledger out of her coat, and the water had got into it, but the figures were still there, column after column of them, and she held it up in the lamplight and said, "This is 6 years of your books, Rance. For 100 head that was never on the range. A team that was never sold for glue. Money that went somewhere that wasn't feed or fence or salt. And I've already given it to Bess. and Bess has the sheriff's word that she'll bring it to him if I'm not back by morning." Rance looked at her, and for a moment he was just a man in the rain with a plan that had come apart. Then he moved. He came at her, and she was smaller than him, and she knew it. And she did not run, because she had learned from her father that you do not run from a thing you have already beaten. She held the ledger up like a shield, and she said, "You can take this from me, Rance. You can't take it from the sheriff. And you can't take it from the whole town, because I've told Bess to tell everyone." And that was when the lanterns came down the road, a dozen of them, bobbing through the rain. And the first voice she heard was Jude's, high and fierce, and behind him the brothers, and behind them the sheriff of Fallow Creek on a big bay horse, with Bess's apron still in his hand. Rance looked at the lanterns. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the money on the chute, and the grays standing in the rain, and the girl who had ridden 8 miles bareback through a flood to catch him. He tried to run then, and the gray stepped into his path, quiet and patient, and stood there like a wall, and Rance stopped, because there was nowhere left to go. The sheriff took him before he could say a word. The money went back into the Reach's accounts. The grays and the stock were walked home through the rain, and the rain kept coming, and the creek kept rising, and Marin rode the gray at the head of them all, with the water running off her and the ledger safe in her coat. And here is the question that hung in the rain that night, and I want you to hold it with you. What does a woman do with a truth she has carried alone for so long that she has forgotten anyone else could carry it with her? The rain stopped before dawn, the way hard rains do, and the valley woke up clean and green and smelling of wet earth, the first green in 4 months. The creek ran bankful and brown and sang all day. The cattle came out of the cottonwoods and drank. And the Reach, which had been dying, stood up and shook itself like a dog. The air smelled of wet sage and turned earth, and the whole valley seemed to let out a breath it had been holding for months. They spent the next 3 days putting the place back together. The brothers mended the fence that the wind had taken down. Silas hummed to the stock and counted them back into the near pasture. Jonas watched the sky and said the weather had turned for good, and for once he was right. Thaddeus laughed, loud and relieved, and clapped everybody on the back, and even Ezra, who had been quiet since the railhead, squared his shoulders and set to work like a man who had something to prove. And Marin went back to the forge. The gray had thrown a shoe somewhere on the road home. She'd felt it go in the dark, a soft pop in the mud, and he was standing on 3 shoes and a raw hoof, favoring it the way he'd favored the off-hind that first morning, and she built the fire and set to work on him like it was the only work in the world. She talked to him low and steady while she worked. She trimmed the hoof back to true. She fit the shoe hot, and she set it cool, and she nailed it home, and the gray stood for her the whole time, patient as a thing that had learned to trust. Ezra came and stood in the door of the forge and watched her. He watched her for a long time, and she didn't look up, because she'd learned that the work says what needs saying. "You knew," he said at last. "The whole time. You knew about the grays, and you knew about the books, and you knew about him, and you carried it." "I carried it because there was nobody to carry it with," Marin said. She set the last nail and ran her hand down the gray's leg, and the horse leaned into her, and she led him. That's all carrying is. Holding a thing steady until somebody else is ready to hold it with you. Ezra was quiet a long time. Then he said, in a voice she'd never heard from him, "Papa taught you everything. The hammer, the books, the horses. And he never taught me a thing worth keeping, because I was the one who had to be the man, and I was too busy being the man to learn to be anything else." He looked down at his hands. "I spent my whole life trying to be the one he was proud of, and he gave it all to you." The forge was quiet. The fire settled. The gray breathed. The only sound was the last of the rain dripping off the eaves and the soft tick of the cooling iron. "I was the one who held the horse still," Marin said, "while you all got to ride. That was my whole life, Ezra, holding things still so the rest of you could go somewhere. And I never once minded it, because holding things still is a kind of going somewhere too. It's just that nobody ever sees it." Ezra looked at her, and something in his face came apart and went back together in a different shape. "I see it," he said. "I see it now." And that was the moment the story turned, and I know some of you felt it. That's the one that gets most of us, because most of us have been the one holding the horse still. If this story has meant something to you tonight, leave a like, and if you want a place to land at the end of a long day, subscribe. It's free, and it means the world to me. Now let me finish this for you." The next morning, Mr. Crane came out to the forge. He came slow, on his bad legs, with his measuring look, and he stood in the door and watched Marin work for a long time before he spoke. "The sheriff brought your books to me," he said. "Bess brought them, and the sheriff brought Rance, and the money's back in the accounts. Every cent of it. 6 years of it." Marin nodded. She didn't stop working. "The books are honest now," she said. "That's what matters." Crane looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he'd looked at her that first day over the feed column. "You could have taken the credit," he said. "You could have come to me the day you found it, and told me you'd saved the Reach, and asked for the foreman's job or half the place or anything you wanted. And you didn't." "I didn't save the Reach," Marin said. "I just set the iron true. The Reach saved itself. It just needed somebody to hold the work steady while it did." Crane was quiet a long time. And then he said, "My sons are gone. One's dead, and one's in California, and neither of them ever once looked at this place the way you look at it." He took a breath. "I've got a ledger that's honest now, and a team that's sound, and a family of 7 in my bunkhouse. I've got more than I've had in years. And I've got you to thank for all of it." Marin looked at him, and she said the second line of the story worth carrying. "I don't need to be first, Mr. Crane. I just need to be the one the work can lean on." And she went back to her shoeing, and Crane stood in the door a long time, and behind him, in the yard, Jude stood exactly where she'd stood that first morning, with her hammer in his hands, watching her the way you watch a thing you're learning to become. The trial came in the fall, and it was short. Rance Whitfield stood before the judge in Fallow Creek with 6 years of his own ledger laid out against him, and the sheriff's testimony, and the Grays standing in the yard outside the courthouse as evidence of what he'd meant to do to them. He was convicted of stealing cattle and falsifying accounts, and he was sent to the territorial prison for 7 years, and the Reach got back every cent the courts could find. It was a formal end, and it came from his own choices, and nobody in the valley had to lift a hand against him to make it happen. The town talked about it for a month. They talked about the foreman who'd been filling his own ledger for 6 years, and about the old man who'd been too trusting to see it, and about the girl who'd ridden 8 miles bareback through a flood with the proof in her coat. Some of them had seen her at the railhead that night, and they told it like a story, and the story grew in the telling, the way stories do, until the girl on the gray horse became a thing the valley was proud of. But Marin didn't hear most of it, because Marin was at the forge. Mr. Crane gave her the forge outright, not as a favor, but as a deed, written out and signed and witnessed, with the Reach's brand on it. He gave her the books too, the honest ones, and told her the accounts were hers to keep, because she was the only one who'd ever made them tell the truth. And then he did the thing that meant the most, though he never said it out loud. He had the brothers build her a proper forge, a real one, with a stone chimney and a bellows that worked and a roof that didn't leak. The brothers built it in a week. Micah carved the door handle into a horse's head and said nothing. Silas hummed while he laid the stone. Jonas checked the sky and said they'd have good weather for the raising, and for once he was right. Thaddeus clapped everybody on the back and laughed too loud, and Ezra squared his shoulders and laid the last stone himself. And when it was done, he stood in the door of the new forge and looked at his sister and said, "It's a good forge. It'll hold." "It'll hold," Marin said. "Iron set true holds." The winter came, and the Reach went through it with honest books and a sound team and a full hay loft. The spring came, and the grass came up thick and green off the rain that had broken the drought, and the herd grew, and the creek ran clear, and the Reach, which had been dying, was the strongest place in the valley. The Tollivers stayed. Bess stayed. The cook's girl who'd counted what came in and what went out stayed, and she and Marin kept the books together, and the two of them could make a column of figures tell the truth faster than any man in Fallow Creek. And the brothers changed. Not all at once, and not in any way they ever said out loud, but the way men change when they learn to see. Micah whittled less and worked more. Silas talked to the horses the way Marin did, low and steady. Jonas stopped checking the sky for weather that wasn't coming and started checking the herd instead. Thaddeus laughed a little less loud. And Ezra stopped squaring his shoulders before he spoke, because he'd finally found something he didn't have to prove himself against. The last day of spring, Mr. Crane came out to the new forge. His legs were worse, and he came slow, leaning on a stick that Jude had carved for him, and he stood in the door and watched Marin work for a long time. She was shoeing the gray, the same gray, the one that had thrown two grown men and then carried her through the flood, and the horse stood for her like a dog, patient and easy, the fear long gone out of his eyes. You know, Crane said, I hired one brother last spring. I thought I was getting a hand for the roundup, and instead I got 6 brothers and a sister, and the sister outworked them all. Marin didn't look up. She set the last nail, and she ran her hand down the gray's leg, and she said, I didn't outwork them, Mr. Crane. I just held the work steady while they did the lifting. That's all I've ever done. That's all anybody ever needs to do, Crane said. And it's the rarest thing there is. He turned to go, and then he stopped, and he looked back at her, and he said the thing he'd been carrying for a year. Marin, I want you to know, the Reach is going to need somebody to run it, one day, when I'm gone. And I've been thinking that somebody ought to be the one who held it steady when it was coming apart. I've been thinking it ought to be you. Marin stood very still. The forge was quiet. The fire settled. The gray breathed. And she said the last line of the story worth carrying. Quiet. The way her father had taught her to say things that mattered. Worth doesn't announce itself, Mr. Crane. It just rings, like a shoe set true on a good horse, when the whole valley is quiet enough to hear it. And then, because the light was long and gold that last day of spring, she picked up her hammer and set to work on the gray's last shoe, and the sound of it rang out over the yard and the green valley. A clear, true ring, like a bell that had waited all her life to be struck. The gray stood in the long light, sound on all 4 feet, and the brothers came out of the bunkhouse to watch her, and Jude stood closest, her hammer in his hands, learning to hold it steady. And the valley held its breath, and the ring went out over water and grass and cottonwoods, still going when the sun went down. Tomorrow night, I've got another one for you. A story about a woman who was told her whole life that her hands were too small for the work, and what she built with them anyway. If this one found you tonight, come back for that one, and bring somebody who needs to hear it. Until then, hold the work steady, and be the one the people you love can lean on. Good night, and thank you for listening.